Hi everyone, as Eric said, I'm Angela. Thank you very much to the NSPKU for inviting me to speak. I was saying to Suzanne that it's such a privilege for the NSPKU to ask me because, showing my age here, when I was growing up with PKU, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have Google. The only thing my parents and I had was the small green booklet, and it was a paper booklet, and it was The Child with PKU. And it was the thing that Mum and Dad had on their bedroom side. Now, if we wanted to know anything about PKU, we looked in this booklet. If it wasn't in the booklet, we didn't know it, and no one else knew it. So the NSPKU, in that respect, has always been with my parents and I throughout my life. So thank you to the NSPKU for asking me. So today I'm going to talk a bit about stories, but first of all, I thought it would just be interesting for you to know a little bit about me. As Eric said, I have PKU, I have HPA type, it's quite a mouthful to say hyperphenylalaniemic phenylketonuria, so HPA PKU is usually what I say. I am on diet. I've been on diet since I was 20. Up until I was 20, I hadn't heard of supplements, they were never discussed, and so I'm 35 now, so I've been on diet for 15 years, and have to say, best decision I ever made, and have never looked back. So I have sort of two dual existences really. I work and I study. So for my work, to fund the studying if you like, as Eric said, I work at Business Disability Forum. I originally started in the NHS in occupational therapy, dementia services and rehabilitation, and speaking to patients about coming to terms with either acquiring a condition or coping with a condition, and really navigating some really sort of life-changing things that had happened to them. As I said, particularly with people who had acquired a condition, an injury or dementia. From there, I became really interested in sort of the diverse range of how those stories of people's lives change depending on where they had come from or what religion they were. So I trained in human resources management, and that's what sort of led me to Business Disability Forum now, really. So from HR, I then trained in disability discrimination law, and at Business Disability Forum, I manage the team of disability discrimination advisors, and I also manage our policy function as well. So academically, my degrees have been in theology and also law. In both of those, I've been really interested in the role of minority voices and how people whose voices haven't been heard before, really. So whether that's a patient or whether it's a certain type of person within a religion who hasn't really had the chance to speak their story before, that's what my research has been in. And now for my PhD, I'm looking at how the role of group emotions influence policy decisions. And I'm really, really interested in how social movements, particularly social movements about disability or a health condition, influence policy changes. So, for example, how protests can influence government decisions to grant funding for treatment. So I guess, as you can probably tell, stories have been a part of my research academically and also part of my work life. One of the things I'll talk about later is about how we use our story to talk about our PKU. And in my job at the moment, I work with employers, and one of the biggest questions I'm asked, the most common question I'm asked, is for employers to say, how do we get more people to tell us that they have a condition or a disability? And it's really interesting when I speak to employees and people and patients, they say, how do I tell my employer this? And I go to work and employers are saying, how do we get more people to tell us about their condition? So the two aren't really there's a chasm between those two, and that's the space I'm interested in. So I've used the word story a lot so far. What is a story? there's a guy who advises people on how to write a good story, and his name's Philip Martin, and he says a story is how we learn to take the confusing flow of many things that happen and try to make sense of them. Now, he's talking about narratives in sort of fictional stories, but I thought that was a nice quote to sort of apply to our lives. Now, when I've researched stories with people who have experienced trauma and have found support in a support group or network of some kind, I asked them, what does a story do for you? Why is your story important to you? And the top 3 answers that came back were, my story passes on a meaning. So if I have difficulty saying this happened to me, I tell a story. So the first thing is a story passes on a meaning of some kind. Secondly, people said my story conveys what's important to me. It passes on sort of what's my values, what's important to me. And when I've spoken to communities or support groups, they've said the same thing. Our story tells what our values are as this support group. And the third thing, which was really interesting, is that people were saying that stories are essentially a social tool. As you tell someone a story, or you hear a story from someone. So in that sense, a story is a very social thing, and it's a way of connecting to another person. So although stories can be many things, as I said, they could be fiction, they could be something that we write about ourselves, and they can be real, so something that actually happened, or they can be imagined as well. So for some people that have worked with learning disabilities or dementia, and I've asked about their lives, they haven't used the first person, they haven't said this happened to me or I did this. They've told a story about a girl, or they've told a story about a lady who had an accident. So it's more than third person, but it's kind of an imagined story that they distance from themselves. But for us today, I'm talking about stories in the context of it being the narrative about how we talk about our experience of having PKU. So in all of my research and my work on stories, I found that stories operate at kind of 2 levels. So stories are, first of all, important for the community, but they're also important at an individual level as well. So when I speak to communities, and by community I can mean an employer, so a particular workplace, or I might mean a support organisation, NSPKU for example, or a specific town or a specific culture. So a community can be any one of those things. The really interesting thing is in every culture, every religion I've studied, stories are central to the identity of that group and that community. So stories solidify, as I said before, what this patient said to me, it solidifies the values and the identity of a community or group of people. And we identify the values, beliefs or purpose of a community by their stories. So for example, if I told you a story about 3 wise men visiting a baby, you might think, 3 wise men, Jesus, Christianity. So although I haven't said Christ or Christianity to you, you can sort of think about, 3 wise men, that's Christianity. So the story, you can identify the values of a group from their story. For us, if people were to read in the newspaper about the campaign to get funding for Cavan, people would hopefully in the future think, NSPKU, that's what they're talking about, that's their story. So it's this thing about the story we tell being reflective of what's important to us, and then that giving us our identity. But the other thing I found is that storytelling within communities reinforces solidarity and support and a shared vision. I found this particularly in disability and health rights, but also in the gay and lesbian movement, where for example, if you see like a rainbow flag, you know that that's the symbol of their movement. And one of the key things they say is it's this word solidarity. The stories within our community, everyone recognises them, and that's what keeps our community together, that shared story. I heard a lovely thing on Radio 4 just a couple of weeks ago, and I can't remember who was speaking or anything, but the show was about migrants feeling at home in the country they now lived in. And the presenter said to this woman on the show, she said, who was a migrant, she said, "What is home to you?" And the lady replied, "Home is where you're in a place and you know what the stories are. You recognise the stories of that community. And when you understand the stories of where you live, then that's your home." And I thought that was quite a nice analogy, even for us as PKUs, when us as PKU individuals and also as an NSPKU community start solidifying what's important to us and what we want, and that becomes our story, then that solidarity that comes from that, it kind of is a place that's home. It's somewhere that we recognise, and it's a safe place. My favourite thing about exploring stories in social movements is that ultimately social movements change things. From, if we think about the history of women's rights, we've had the women's movement and feminism. If we think about disability rights, we look at how in the 60s and the 70s, disabled people just went out to the streets. They protested. It was a very passionate movement, and it ultimately got the Disability Discrimination Act 1995, in which all of us can now work. So people with disabilities, people with health conditions, this is the piece of legislation that said you cannot discriminate against people with disability or long-term conditions. And that was only through that change, that legislation change was only possible by a community forming their story and then telling it on the streets. And I think that's really exciting. But what I'm going to focus on today are how stories are important for the individual. So I guess I'm speaking to the PKUs in the room predominantly, but hopefully the rest of you will get something from this, because I'm interested in what stories and storytelling does for us with PKU. So in order to do that, let's think about the structure of a story. So a story has a beginning and a middle, not an end, but a future. So the beginning is your past. So, for example, the beginning, and thinking about the past or the beginning of your story, what's happened so far, stories help us make sense of what's happened, of our experiences. So, as I said at the beginning, I started diet when I was 20. Is that when I tell my story of PKU, is that when my PKU story starts? For some of you, you might have been on diet all of your life. Is that your story? So this forming and thinking through the past or the beginning, where you start your story, really helps you make sense of what happened and how you feel about it. And then you have the middle of your story, which is actually the present. It's what's going on now. Where are you now? What's happening? How do you feel about that? And this helps us think through if we are on the right track for what we want for our future. And then, as I said, the stories that when I've spoken to communities and people who are storytelling to make sense of an experience, there's not an end to the story, there's just a future. So in the sense your story doesn't end, your story is your life, if you like. So when you are thinking about what you've been through, i.e. the beginning of your story in your past, and then you think about, okay, where am I now? You then think about, is where I am now on the right track for what I want for my future? So your future is who you want to be and what you want to achieve. So as I said, one of the most common things I'm asked from employers is how they can get more of their employees to tell them about a condition. And as a PKU, I've obviously had to tell lots of employers that I have PKU at various stages in my career. And as I said, in other jobs I've had, people have come to me and said, okay, well, how do I tell my employer? So it's this gap between employees being nervous to share information and employers wanting employees to do it more, but not knowing how to create the culture in which employees are comfortable to do that. So a lot of businesses and a lot of my clients are currently thinking about how they can launch storytelling campaigns in their businesses. So I go into a lot of workplaces now and I see posters and social media campaigns just within that business about storytelling and for how employees, how they are encouraging their employees to tell their story of their condition at work. So one of the key, there are two key terms that I hear a lot and is in my inbox every day of my working life. First one is disclosure, and the second one is openness. So by disclosure, it's kind of a word we've been using for a long time now to describe, I mean, essentially it's telling someone about your PKU. There's a lot of tension around the word disclosure, and there have been a lot of research projects recently between businesses and employees that show actually employees don't like the word disclosure much. So when employers are saying, please disclose your disability to us, employees are kind of shrinking away from that because it feels like quite legal, quite a scary term, that if you disclose something, you're sharing something really big, dark, like a big dark secret or something. So a lot of businesses are moving away from the term disclosure and just saying what it is. So for example, please tell us about your disability. And there was some research in 2015 with disabled graduates which showed that final year students with disabilities and conditions at university were the thing that they were most worried about was having to tell their employer where they were first going into the workplace about a disability or about a condition. And one of the things that the graduates came up with is, well, let's not call it disclosure, let's call it openness. We're just being open, this is who we are. So the important thing for stories is that when you know your story, you'll know what information is relevant to share at what time and with who. So when you get to sort of thinking through your story, you'll know that it's not appropriate or it's not relevant to tell everyone your story at any time. So for example, I started telling you all at the beginning of my presentation that I have PKU, what I do for a living and what I study, because those things are relevant to what I'm talking about. However, there's also other things about me that I haven't told you, such as I have cats. I hate hot sunny days, they make me stroppy. I hate long train journeys. But I didn't start with that because it's not relevant to what I'm saying. So it's about finessing your story and forming your story. It helps you decide what is relevant to tell this person at what time as well. So the first thing you need to do is define, when you're faced in a situation of, okay, I need to tell this person that I have PKU, you first need to define what you want out of telling that person. So let's apply an employer situation, for example. So when I get to a situation where I think, okay, I need something, so I need to tell my employer that I have PKU, I try and plan that conversation. So I first of all think, what do I want out of telling them? I'm not going to tell them for the sake of it, because that doesn't give them anything, doesn't help them, and it doesn't help me either. So what do I want out of this conversation? Usually it's because I need time off to go to the hospital, or I'm going to start a new supplement, so I want a few days off to just be at home and deal with that. So what do you want out of telling this person? And the second thing is define what information is relevant for them to know. So one of the things that I find at work is that an employee either, there are two things that can happen in this situation. Either an employee goes into this discussion with their line manager and tells them everything about PKU and all of their symptoms and how they manage it, and it becomes a sort of outpouring of everything about PKU. Or the second thing is that the employer thinks, okay, this is big. You know, I've got medical history here, I've got terms I can't even say, and I can't say myself either, and I don't know what to do with this. So you kind of need to plan that conversation and figure out what's relevant at this time for this person. I heard an agreement from a little baby there. That's good, thanks. Sometimes I've spoken to my manager and I've told them some things, like I have PKU and I take supplements for that. I'm about to start this new supplement, so I'm just going to take 3 days to just be at home with that. So, and that's all they need to know for that conversation. They need to know that I want 3 days off, and they also need to know why as well. Now, further down the line, if I need something else, then it might be appropriate to tell them something else about my PKU. So, for example, in my job, I have to do a lot of presentations, and sometimes I find it really difficult to navigate getting to places. So I'm really, really terrible at following maps and directions. So I usually get a cab from where I'm going, from where I am to where I'm going, to take me to the front door. And then the second thing is I really struggle with my tremor. And I always worry that it looks like I'm really frightened in front of people, although I actually really enjoy it. So when I have I remember I had a huge presentation coming up, and I said to my manager, I'm worried about this because I want it to be a good, confident presentation, but my tremor makes me look like I'm shaking all the time, and I have this tremor because... Now, I had that conversation, and my manager was great, but it was like, okay, well, what do you want me to do about it? Are you just telling me because you're worried about it, or because you want me to do something about it? So it wasn't the wrong thing to do to tell my manager, but I didn't give her anything about, okay, well, what's the solution? What do you want me to do about that? So the first thing, define what you want out of having that conversation, and second, what is the relevant information at that time? And it's this. And the bit about relevant information is really important, because when you get good at sort of telling your story to different people, you'll get to know that, and actually you don't tell everyone the same information. So, for example, what you tell your employer is probably going to be a little bit different to what you tell a potential partner. In a relationship, different things about PKU are more relevant than when you tell your employer. So, I'm a real geek for data. I love statistics and data and evidence to prove stuff. So I can't do a presentation without some numbers. So I mentioned some of the research that came out about graduates, disabled graduates and graduates with long-term conditions. And this came out about the same time another piece of research came out about employees who were already in work with disabilities and conditions as well. These are my favourite figures from that research, and it's really interesting. So first of all, 76% of graduates with disabilities or a long-term condition worry about telling a future employer about a condition. So that's a lot of people. That's 76% of graduates worry about having this conversation. At the end of your degree, it should be a really exciting time. You know, you're qualified, you've got letters after your name, you're going into the world of work, you can earn your own money and not be in student debt. And 76% are worrying about this. The second statistic that really grabbed me was that 57% of graduates, only 57%, think it's actually beneficial to tell their employer about their condition. That's just over half of people think it's worth sharing this information with your employer. The really interesting thing is this last statistic. 63% of employees do not tell their employer they have a condition unless they need something. So that sort of that goes back to what I was saying about why are you having this conversation? Because 63% of people are only telling their employer if they need something. I'm not saying whether that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying I think that's interesting. Just over half of people are planning those conversations. So we're talking about stories, story time. Two little short stories of things that happened to me. So the first one is happened a few years ago, actually. I went to the supermarket. And one of the things I really struggle with when my tremor is bad is that I struggle to get money out of my purse, or to pick up the coins, or to put to type my PIN number on the PIN pad. My fingers are everywhere. I'm right-handed. The tremor is worse on my right side. So usually my go-to thing when I'm in a shop is so often the shop assistant, when I'm getting my money out, will say, "Oh, you look cold, dear," and I'll say, "Yes, freezing out." When it's a hot day, I can't really get away with that. But on this occasion, I was in a grump. I had a bad day. I was stroppy and I was stressed. And the lady in the supermarket said, "Oh, is it cold out there? I thought it was sunny." And I said, "You know what? I've got PKU. It's a condition and it makes me shake." And her eyes widened. She looked at me and she went, "Oh dear." Pressed the emergency button under the counter, and the supervisor came over. And then the shop assistant whispered to the supervisor something I couldn't hear, and the supervisor said, "I am so sorry. Can I offer you some vouchers?" And I said, "Vouchers because I have PKU." And she said, we really didn't mean to offend you, and I am so sorry." I said, "Really, it's fine." And I paid for my stuff and I walked away. And as I walked away, I thought, damn it, I wanted those vouchers. I didn't take them. But that was the first thing that happened. So just bear that in mind for a second while I tell you my second story. So my second story was a work situation. I was in a job. I worked really hard. I was an equality and diversity advisor, and I had secured a promotion to diversity manager in the same company. Just after I had been offered that role as diversity manager, I changed my supplement, and I don't know what your experiences are of changing supplements, but for me, I get sick. I get headaches while my body is adjusting. It's not a happy time. So in the very few times that I have changed my supplement, I've taken a few days off to get used to that. So the doctor gave me a fit note, not to have time off work completely, but just to say, can this person work from home for 3 days? So I took it into my manager, and she said, "Okay, that's fine, we'll think about it, thank you." Okay, and the next day I was called into the office with the head of HR and my line manager, and they said, "We didn't know you had PKU. We don't want to give you more work than what you can cope with, so therefore we are withdrawing your offer of promotion as diversity manager in this organisation." Okay, and I was really shocked and a little bit insulted because I advise on discrimination law in that company. So I did this funny thing where I whispered under my breath, "What are you doing?" And then realised actually this is real and this is happening to me. And I said, okay, that's fine. And I went home and I told my friend about it. And she said, "Wow, what did they do when you handed in your resignation?" And I thought, yeah, that's right. So I handed in my resignation, and I thought, I don't want to be in a place that's not going to value me and that's going to treat me like that. So it's not a case of, yeah, I could file a discrimination claim. It could be an employment tribunal, but hey, that's expensive, it's going to stress me out more than it will them. I just don't, who wants to be in a place where they're not valued for their talent? So I resigned and got a really good job somewhere else. Thank you. So the point's this. There's a difference between using your story as power over someone else, or to empower yourself. And it's a really important difference. And the thing is, our stories are defined by how we reflect and interpret those experiences that we have. So in my two stories, they had two things in common. First of all, in both of them, I told someone else I had PKU. The second thing they have in common is that both of those people I told reacted quite badly, or, not in a way that I expected. So if they've got those things in common, why did, for one of them, in the supermarket, what that ended up being is me being very embarrassed. And I didn't get my vouchers. But it created a scene. So the supervisor came over. I've now got a row of people who are waiting to pay for their shopping, and they're all looking at me. Not the person I've tried to embarrass. They're looking at me. So I didn't plan to tell my story in that way. It wasn't a planned conversation. I had no reason for doing it, really. I was just grumpy and stroppy on that day. Usually I just agree that it's cold. And it turned out quite badly for me. I was embarrassed and I didn't get my vouchers. In the second story, I didn't react immediately. They did act badly, and at a very basic level, it was probably discrimination from the employer. But I didn't react emotionally immediately. I came away, I thought about it and thought, do I want to be in this situation? What is staying here going to do for me as a person with PKU, but also for someone who has 4 degrees and who can manage a lot of responsibility and who has got a very experienced career background? Actually, no, this place is not going to help me grow. So the thing is this, we need to learn how to respond in the right way to how people respond to our PKU. The thing that's taken me a long time to learn is that we can't control how people are going to respond, but we can control to how we respond to that. So I know I'm running out of time, but I'm just going to go on a few more minutes if that's okay. Is that all right? So back to defining our story. So those first steps that I spoke about, you first need to think about and be able to talk about, firstly, what has happened so far? And like I said before, when does your story start? And then secondly, where do you want your story to go? What are your ambitions, your goals, what do you want to achieve in the future? And then crucially, what do you need to get there? So for where you are in your life right now, are you on the right track for what you want the future of your story to be? When you reflect on where you are now, which is the middle and the present that we spoke about earlier, that's how you can define if you are on the right track to the future of your story. So apart from the structure of the story, there's also 2 other things you need to think of. We've spoken a bit about sort of the purpose of your story, but the tone's really important as well. And purpose and tone are actually linked quite a bit. So first of all, the purpose of your story. Now, there are so many different stories with different purposes. For some people, they tell their story to encourage others. So, for example, the tone might be, or the narrative, might be, I did this and it was amazing and you can do it too. That's a really different energy if you're trying to encourage someone to do something to if you are, for example, trying to influence a policy change and you take to the streets and you protest. So, for example, this was dire and it needs to change. I had this awful experience and it can't happen to other people. Those tones that I'm telling those stories in are really different. So you need to think about, when you're writing your PKU story, it's about who is this for and what do I want them to feel or get from it, Do I want people to feel encouraged? Am I talking to other PKUs to encourage and support them? Or is my story for decision makers, for policy makers? Am I telling them this is so bad and it mustn't happen again and this is what needs to change? And the tone of your story is important because it also lends to the purpose, but it's also quite a self-reflective process to work out the tone. So for example, think about when you're sort of forming your story, how do you feel about it? Does it make you happy? Does it make you angry? Are you proud of your story or are you scared? And the next bit, when you've defined how you feel about your story, is thinking about, is that how you want to feel about it? And then, of course, we need to think about, okay, if I don't want to feel like this, what do I need to do in order to feel differently about it? So, stories, disclosure, storytelling and writing on stories. What is the point for a person with PKU to all of this? I mean, two things really. First of all, you, me, we are the authors. So our stories can be whatever we want them to be. That's a bit corny, but it's true. We write the story and we define it. But secondly, you can edit your story. If you don't like how things are going, change it. You're the author of this. I was working with someone who's a disability rights activist, and he does courses on personal development for people who have conditions. The first thing in those courses, on day one, the very first activity that he gets people to do is draw a picture of how they see their PKU. So if you had to draw PKU, what would it look like? I mean, the first thing he says is that he realised how many bad artists there are out there. But the second thing is, if you draw a picture that is not good and you don't like, if you feel bad about your PKU, how are you going to make your employer feel good about it? How are you going to, if you don't feel positive about your PKU, how are you going to make someone else see that it's a good thing about you as well? And this is the really sobering thought. Writing a story is a huge responsibility. Everywhere I've studied stories, the storyteller in a community and the people who write and narrate the stories are really well-respected people. And this is something that goes back millennia. In ancient cultures, the storyteller of the community are seen with, they receive gifts, they are the privileged person in the community. It's a big responsibility. It's seen as a really sort of a pillar of the community role. So it's a big responsibility because we are responsible for how the story turns out. And that's a huge challenge, even to me, learning as a 35-year-old now. And when I've worked with people in trauma writing their story, I worked with women in domestic violence situations who had come into refuge situations. The thing that I constantly saw when I asked, do you think you can change your circumstances? Most of them said no. And that was the saddest thing. You can't change having PKU, but you can manage it differently and you can manage the people around you. And the most difficult thing and the best thing about this storytelling stuff is that we are responsible for how it works out and we make the decision about how we want our life to go. So how do we as a PKU community respond to that? I mean, that's a question for us today. It might be, how do we draw on one another's resources? I've spoken to just people today who are working in a similar sector to me. I know other people with PKU who are really talented, have fantastic salaries, are business owners, are academics. How do we share those gifts and those talents among each other so that we can harness the skills and the strengths of one another within this NSPKU community? That's something we can think about. So as I finish, as I reflect on what the future of stories in the PKU space are, I can see that the structure of PKU care, and PKU treatment is shifting. The NSPKU's Patient Voices Survey, I mean, to my knowledge, it's the biggest, if not the first, survey of people with PKU where I could write my experience in qualitative format. We've got a newly formed all-party parliamentary group on PKU. That's huge. I'm involved in APPGs quite a lot on disability, and it's a really impactful, wonderful way to get things changed. And there's an increased number of, for the geeks like me who follow sort of parliamentary questions, there's an increased number of PKU-related questions that are asked in Parliament now. These are huge changes, and these are not spanned across decades, like a lot of social movements experienced very slow change. These are things that have happened really recently, within the last 6 to 12 months. That's really huge. So the structure for PKU and PKU people and care is changing. So therefore, we're in a different context, a different culture of telling our stories. The space for telling our stories is becoming safer, and it's becoming a hungry space where people are actually asking for our voices as well. So the stories we write after today need to address the question, what do we want for our lives as individuals with PKU, but also as a PKU community? I'll finish with a quote. This fell into my inbox as I was on my way here, actually. The Royal College of Nursing are launching their Power of Storytelling campaign. It's an internal campaign, so they are asking employees to do this. They want stories of people's stories about feeling included. And they've asked me to come in onto that project. And they showed me the flyer that they've created for this. And these are the words on that flyer, which I thought were really beautiful. The stories that we share with each other are powerful and important. They link us to our past, anchor us in our present, and provide a pathway into the future. Our stories can transfer wisdom and provide inspiration and ideas for tackling tough times, as well as moments to share and celebrate triumphs. The stories that we choose to share, both as individuals and as a community, are deeply necessary for our development, as well as generating and cementing change. We need stories to emotionally feel what others do. We need stories to combat isolation so that we do not feel alone. So on that note, there's an action for us all today, and that's to contribute to the NSPKU's My PKU Story campaign. Now, you're about to see something rare, because the way Dr. Rahman at my PKU clinic tests to see how good or bad my tremor is he asks me to hold up a piece of paper. So I rarely do this in presentations, but here it is. This is look at that tremor go, isn't that beautiful? This is a PKU tremor, everyone. These leaflets are on the table for each of you to pick up, and this is the NSPKU's My Story campaign. Come and pick one of these up and share your story with the NSPKU of your life with PKU. Thank you for listening to me.